Depending on the openings you play, you may be more or less familiar with closed positions. These positions are characterized by lots of pawns still on the board, and specifically the center being locked down. I really enjoy playing closed positions, but I used to kind of struggle with them because they require a different kind of play than positions with more open lines. So in this video, I'm going to share 5 rules to help you better understand how to play in these closed positions. So a closed position often requires a lot of patience, and to sort of emulate that, in this video, we're only going to be using one example. So take a good look at the position in front of you. You are going to get very familiar with it throughout the course of this video, and let's jump right in. So number 1, usually pawn moves are the most critical in closed positions. Now what does that mean? That means that because your pawns are so locked down, when you finally do decide to make a pawn move, or when your opponent does, that should be the time when you're spending the most thought, because it will fundamentally change the structure of what you're seeing on the board. So I think a lot of times there is a tendency to want to break open the position as soon as possible and create some kind of a pawn break like right away, and not want the position to remain closed for very long. And that can work just fine in some cases. You can, break open the position as early as possible, get your open lines, get some tactics going. But in other cases, it's actually a lot better to keep the position closed, but you have to know how to play these kind of locked pawn structures. So a lot of players right away might be tempted with a move like g6, just striking at the point of the pawn chain, right, and hoping to break down this locked structure. Well, first of all, the problem is you're blundering a pawn here, but even if you're able to get, your king up and then, prepare this pawn push, it's actually not the best move. It allows the position to open up, which might be what you want. You might want to get your bishop here and maybe go after this backwards pawn, but at the same time, it allows for white's pieces, which are currently not doing too much, to potentially get over here. The king isn't super safe, and it could create a whole host of problems that you wouldn't have if you just leave the pawn structure like this. White can't really do anything. It's really hard for white to push forward over here. When you're considering whether or not to play a pawn move like this and open up the position, it's worth asking yourself, okay, is this going to be better for my opponent's pieces or for my pieces? In this case, we have the potential to get the bishop here where it might be a little bit more active, but after white defends this pawn, it's really not doing too much more on g6 than it is right now on f7. Now, if we flip the board, and again, thinking about whether or not we want to push pawns, white has clearly been building up to this break here on b4 by placing both the knight and the bishop and the rook where they can support this pawn push. And so if we're playing as black, right, it would be in our best interest to prevent this plan, because it's not, the scariest thing in the world, but we would actually like to have more control over this square ourselves and not allow white to have that. Another mistake I see a lot of times in these kind of positions is trying to move pawns forward at all costs. A lot of times you hear, like, push your passed pawns. And while we do have a passed pawn here, imagine we were able to get this knight here to protect it. This pawn push is actually not such a good idea, because it's leaving the protection of its buddies back here. And while the knight will have to move, right, this pawn will become a liability on this square because we don't have the pieces to support it going any further. And it's just much simpler to leave it where it's at and keep the structure one cohesive thing, instead of sending one pawn off like as a sacrifice into the void. Number 2, and you probably heard this before, in closed positions, knights are usually better to keep than bishops. Now, like all of these rules, there are exceptions, but you have to learn the rule before you could break it. So this position is kind of unique in that both sides have all of their minor pieces still left on the board. In fact, all of the pieces are still left on the board except for 2 pawns that have been traded off for both sides. But this gives us a really clear example of why usually in these kinds of positions, the knights are better. And the reason for that is that once the pawns are stuck on a particular colored square, in this case it's the light squares for white and it's the dark squares for black, that same colored bishop is going to become kind of useless just because it simply doesn't have the range. On the other hand, knights can jump on whatever square they want, and as we'll talk about in a moment, usually in these closed positions you have the time to sort of reroute your knight, maneuver it to a square where it will be more effective. Now, this doesn't mean that bishops are completely useless. I mean, our dark squared bishop is doing a great job defending this pawn, But it's just not as effective as it would be if half of these pawns were gone and it had some nice open lines to play with. So this is just something good to keep in mind. If you are given the option to trade some minor pieces, it's usually good if you want to trade off one of your bad bishops for one of your opponent's knights and keep your own knights on the board. Number 3 is slow down. If you study a lot of tactics and learn a lot of those patterns, you're used to searching for that immediate knockout blow, the one move that you have to find or the position's completely lost. And it's really important to sort of shift your mindset when you're faced with a closed position like this to one that's more strategic, maneuvering. You have the time to move your pieces to squares where they'll be more effective. There are some famous Grandmaster games that are actually really funny to watch, where one of the players literally takes 4 or 5 moves to walk their king to the other side of the board, so they can create attack on the side where their king was previously castled. A lot of times your plans in closed positions are more about controlling particular squares or moving your piece to a particular square, and that can be an end in and of itself. For example, getting your knight to an outpost square or a semi-outpost square. I'm not sure that's a term, but something like this or this. It's also strategically worth looking at open files. Okay, we have a very nice rook here on this semi-open file. It'd be really nice if we could double or even triple up some pieces here and getting an attack going against this target. But these games are won not by immediately going for the tactical knockout or not by just offering piece trades in the hope of more pieces coming off the board so it'll be more simplified. The games are won by the player that has the most patience, that has the best prophylactic vision to prevent their opponent's threats and then slowly build up the pressure and create threats of their own. Number 4, I've talked about this a little bit already, but restrict your opponent's pieces. Right now, White's pieces are actually doing kind of a nice job of restricting themselves, but we have to see what exactly White wants in this position. So because we have more space in the center, White's plans might revolve around breaking things open and making more space for their pieces on the flanks, specifically these semi-open A and B files. So again, it really seems like White is building up to pushing this pawn, and so if it's black to move here, a move we might consider making is actually A5. So this move does a couple of things. First of all, it prevents the B pawn from pushing forward, which was kind of the entire idea. It also might prepare an eventual knight jump to B4, which would be an outpost square. It might not be best to do that right away. It might be best to sort of prepare it a little bit, or even just pile up the pressure against this weakness that White has and not put the knight there at all, but just take really good control of this B4 square. And that leads us to rule number 5, which is find targets in your opponent's position. So once you've done the evaluation work of figuring out what your opponent wants out of the position, doing the prophylactic work of preventing that, then it's time to figure out what is the weakest part of your opponent's position and start building pressure against that. So sometimes this can be pieces, sometimes it can be pawns, sometimes it's squares on your opponent's side of the board where you might want to put one of your pieces to further restrict your opponent's movement. In this case, we sort of already talked about this B4 square being very important for us to try and control as soon as possible, potentially getting a knight there, or at the very least controlling it with our pawns and pieces. Looking at potential targets is usually good to look at your opponent's backwards pawns, meaning pawns that are not defended by any other pawns, like this one, or this one, or this one. And then again, it's all about patience, building up the threats, and playing simple chess. And quickly flipping the board around, it's also good to look at what our opponent's potential targets might be. That'll also help us with the strategic prophylactic thinking that we were talking about. So our opponent might want to, for example, improve the placement of their knight by getting it to this semi-outpost square, especially if we end up pushing A5. Just essentially blocking down as much activity on the B file as possible, because black will most likely be faster to get pieces onto this file and attack this weak pawn. And if there's time, there are some weak pawns in the black position as well. For example, this one is a backwards pawn, this is a backwards pawn. It's being defended by plenty of things. But just good to keep in mind. This A pawn might also become a target just because it's isolated, it's separated from all of its buddies, and is only being defended by pieces. But it's also important to remember that things change on every single move, so it's really important to reevaluate when your opponent makes a move. How has this changed the position? Are they attacking something new? Have they removed the defense of potentially a target that you could now create? There's so many things you have to keep in mind, and although these positions at first glance might seem like there's not that much tension, one wrong move can suddenly change the game for either side. So I will tell you in this position, if it's black to move, Black is better here, and there are multiple moves that win, so I would challenge you, if you've made it this far in the video, to share in the comments what plan you would most likely go for if you were playing as Black in this position, keeping in mind the rules that we talked about in the rest of the video. Thanks so much for watching, I really do appreciate your support. Don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you soon.